Hi everyone, I'm Cherry, in case you don't remember. We met earlier today, but before I jump in, here's a general content warning and tissues, apparently. I'll be discussing some difficult things relating to disability, death, stigma, and mental health. If you do need to leave at any time, please do. I'm a big advocate for taking care of ourselves. So, representation. It's a loaded subject. It can be subjective, like art, whereas accessibility is maybe more science, which is what I'm used to talking about. But if there's anything I learned from my 12-year career in art, it's that science and art are inseparable. And we are in the exact quarter of Paris that celebrates this union. So I'll set the scene with some words from Emily Grace Burke, who is a wonderful narrative designer that until recently worked at Telltale. You can't do narrative design in a social, cultural, or political vacuum. You're providing players tools to live a story. Their story is informed by the real world. If you're not considering what your players, all of them, might want to do and how they might feel at every moment as they experience the stories in your game, you're not doing narrative design. Thinking intersectionally isn't a plus, it's a must. So keep that in mind, but there will be no tests, I promise. For anyone that can't see my slides, hi Ben. I think you're out there somewhere. Don't worry, they're mostly just to make me look more professional. So, yeah, I'll read them all out. In case you're bad at remembering who I am, I'll introduce myself again. I'm an accessibility consultant, and I stream 4 days a week because I'm a bit of a workaholic, which I did try to make that into a joke, but I'm autistic, so sometimes my jokes fall a bit flat and make everyone feel really awkward, and other times I don't get other people's jokes, and they have to be explained to me, which is also massively awkward. So is awkwardness a disability? I'm not sure. I read my presentations, which is a bit of a no-no, but whatever. If it's good enough for politicians like Barack Obama, it's good enough for me. Besides, my disabilities are a good excuse to break the rules. So after such an amazing day on accessibility, I'm just going to say thank you and congratulations to everyone who's been working so hard to get us to this point today. So now I've set up that nice high note, I'm going to bring us crashing back down to earth. I'm sorry. Recently, during an interview, I was caught off guard, and as I struggle with social filters, I think I called the current state of disability representation a shit show that sucks. I didn't even realize I'd said this until Ian messaged me, and I think affectionately asked, "Is that the title of your talk then?" Whoops. As the pace picks up with accessibility, the percentage of disabled players is growing, so perhaps it's time to have more frank discussions on inclusion. This isn't an easy chat, but I do hope it leaves you with some helpful insight. I'm really glad to see that there were several talks today with, sorry, I will try to slow it down. If I keep you from drinks, I'm really sorry. I'm really glad that I saw many other disclaimers in other talks today, so here's mine. Everyone who works in games pours so much heart, soul, and energy into them, and it can be hard to hear criticism. So I want to reassure you that none of it is personal, and I really don't think games that get representation wrong are necessarily bad games. Many of us work hard to bring diversity to games, and I truly appreciate every effort. I think the mistakes we make as creators are usually due to misunderstanding, so my goal is to demystify disability a little. I also don't want to be a monolithic voice for all disabled people. Anyone can be disabled, and while I've done my best to bring the thoughts in from the community, I am just one person. So what is disability? I struggled with how to give a 30-minute lecture on representation without an hour-long intro on disability culture, because bad representation is rooted in stigma and myth. Well, here's my story in a nutshell. Until my late 20s, I didn't consider myself disabled, and then I took an arrow in the knee, which is not my story. I wish it was that cool. I lived with a lot of undiagnosed physical and cognitive disabilities, which meant living with some unique and difficult misunderstandings and stigma. At 31, I had a sudden stroke. My physical disabilities are degenerative, so I found myself in and out of hospital and trying to rediscover who I was because I'd lost a lot. But I also learned a lot about how negatively I viewed disability. I found the vocabulary and culture to figure out why I'd always struggled so much. It was a revelation. By being forced to acknowledge it, I could finally see myself and my disabilities positively. It's what you make of your situation that defines you. Lara Croft in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I know, Lara Croft said something inspiring. I've been told many times by well-meaning people that I shouldn't let my disabilities define me. But of course my disabilities define me. I don't just let them. I work hard to make them a positive part of who I am. I experience the world through my disabilities. They are me. I work against stigma, exclusion, and accessibility barriers, all with chronic pain, illness, and things like anxiety. I'm proud to be defined by what I make of my situation. I want to celebrate it. If Lara gets that, why can't everybody else? So let's dispel a couple of myths. Surprise, I use a wheelchair. You may have seen me today. Many people assume all wheelchair users have total paralysis, but there are so many other reasons to use one. I use mine for a number of reasons, like weakness that affects my ability to walk, pain, fatigue, and frequent injuries to my hips. Lots of us can stand up, or like me, even walk a little bit. It's not a miracle or someone faking. And yes, I've had people yell this at me, even in a hospital. Sorry. When we do walk or stand, we use things like crutches, canes, or walkers. I hope this generalized list can inspire you when you're thinking of including wheelchairs in your games. They can be used for things like muscular weakness, amputations, severe fatigue, bone or muscle malformations, chronic pain, bone and soft tissue fragility, risk of injury or falls, motor control and movement disorders, and even more than this. The type of wheelchair we use depends on our disabilities or even the financial cost. But somehow, the most common wheelchair we see in games are ugly, heavy things that haven't been used outside of hospitals and temporary situations for more than 30 years. Cloning wheelchair assets also looks pretty silly. I've never met anyone with the exact same wheelchair as mine, and I'd love to see power chairs in games too. So here's a hot tip. If you're Googling for image reference of manual wheelchairs, use the term everyday wheelchair, not just wheelchair. The results are quite different. More ideally, work directly with someone who uses one to learn key features and how they even work. Next myth is autistic stereotypes. Nonverbal children, savant geniuses, or men who lack empathy to the point of hurtfulness or violence. The biggest issue with autistic representation is we're rarely written as people. Usually it's just a set of negative behaviors based on assumptions. The most famous and 30-year-old example, Rain Man's defining traits aren't autism like most people think. It's something called savant syndrome. The fictional characters who I think are most autistic aren't written as such. Futaba from Persona 5 was extremely autistic, but she was described as a shut-in. Similarly, Hilda, the Netflix cartoon, has many qualities of a young autistic girl, but I don't think it's intentional. We have personalities, we're human, even if things like our movements or communication are different. Most surprisingly to people, my empathy can be so intense it overwhelms me physically, but I don't process emotions or sensory information very well, hence why I read my talks. I do like trains, but I'm also incredibly enthusiastic about birds and video games, and can sort of talk to cats. It's only half a joke. The first rule of representation, don't make assumptions because they're usually informed by stigma. Talk to us. It both matters how and how often we're represented. Maybe for no greater reason than how it feels to disabled players. Recent studies are showing that up to 30% of players identify as disabled, so why are less than 1% of game characters? Disability is often forgotten from larger diversity efforts in the industry, whether it's through hiring practices, community efforts, creator platforms, or even discussions on representation. We're left out. Games are greatly important to the lives of disabled people, and Chris this morning covered that pretty well. On a personal level, if you've seen any of my talks before, you already know how important they are to me. But here's a recap. Video games saved my life. The first time I said this, I was consulting with the team who make Gears of War. I meant it to come out as a sort of joke, but as always, I didn't realize how deeply I meant it until I met the eyes of one of the developers, and he quietly and vulnerably said, with a broken voice, "Me too." Regardless of who we are, this can be our most profound common ground. It's one of the things that makes us so passionate in our work. Games have helped me through so many difficult times, all through my life, but maybe especially through pain and disability. By reinforcing stigma, a lack of representation, or even worse, bad representation can be harmful. Everything from ideas that disability makes us worthless, evil, untrustworthy, a burden, or even whether we should want to die. It can cause rifts in relationships when we try to discuss it, or it can acutely affect our enjoyment of a game. It can incite and underpin onslaughts of hatred and toxicity from gamers who use slurs like retard. Negative representation can impact our mental health and self-esteem on every front. It alienates us. But there's still a thrill that can't be beat. That feeling of seeing even a glimpse of yourself, of who you are in a positive light. It's a nudge that you're not alone, that someone gets you. A little indie called To the Moon came close to home. When I played it, I had no idea it was relevant to me at all. So when it captured so much of what it's like to be autistic, I cried. And I don't mean I got teary and can still hold it together. I mean I openly sobbed, breathless, wordless, and completely broken. Of course, this was live on the internet for everyone to see. I was an absolute mess. I'm not kidding, this segment here goes on for 20 minutes, and it was the third time in the game I'd cried. It unlocked feelings I had no idea were so intense, that when I finally saw a shadow of myself, how powerful that would be. The story was not at all like my own life, but there were a lot of similarities in experience. The respect, beauty, and delicacy with which the characters and their struggles were handled was unparalleled. It was so very genuine. It destroyed every stereotype I'd ever seen about how autistic characters are burdens on those around them. To the Moon was told through a deeply affectionate lens about how hard the autistic girl fought to persevere with the people she loved, using unusual but deeply tender gestures. In the end, it was about how a meaningful love was still possible. Inclusion is so powerful. Your ability as creators to tell stories is second to none. I deeply adore games because they are great experiences, no matter the genre. As storytellers and creators of worlds, you have the capacity to move hearts and souls like no other industry I know. Hashtag, disability representation matters. I asked people on Twitter how being represented makes them feel, and the response I got was overwhelmingly about belonging and visibility. I particularly like Jamie's reply. If I exist in the game world, it helps me persist in the real world. It helps me to see a space, event, or community I can be a part of, rather than feeling like a permanent outsider. At the end of the day, that's what it comes down to for disabled people. We already feel like outsiders. Games transcend that. Disabled people are still segregated in society, whether we're stuck at home or when accessibility involves sitting in less desirable sections on transit, in live sports and music venues or cinemas away from our friends. Sometimes we can't even access basic facilities like toilets. The majority of bars, restaurants, clubs, cafes, shops, parks, and more still aren't accessible. Even when we can get into buildings, things like table height or limited space excludes us. Regardless of the poor state of representation, we're less segregated in games. We feel less alone and undesirable. Take this tweet, for example. Daughter is autistic. She doesn't fit in. She doesn't get praise outside of her close family. During the first Forsaken mission, her favorite character told her Tevis would be proud of her. She cried. Thank you, Bungie. You have no idea how much this means. From Andraste Blaze. So what about escapism? I know people who don't want to be reminded of their disabilities. They just want to feel stronger, more powerful, and in less pain. Sometimes it's just about having fun. I understand this. I've lost a lot to progressive disability, and there's a lot of things I've never been able to do. I'm in pain constantly. I spent hundreds of hours being whisked away by Horizon Zero Dawn, losing arrows with ridiculous accuracy and strength, sneaking around in the grasses like my knees aren't made of grass, or glass. Which one? I don't want escapism to go away. I believe that just because we want to enjoy escapism or power fantasy, that disability shouldn't be erased entirely, as it so often is. This quietly reinforces the idea that disability is wrong, and that the ultimate goal for humanity is that we don't exist. It's very unlikely that all disability will ever be cured, and some of us don't want a cure. I believe that to try and cure me of being autistic would erase me as a person. I also love my wheels. But I'd happily take a cure for my failing digestive organs. It's complicated. Mad Max Fury Road was proof that disability and power fantasy can coexist. Furiosa was wicked powerful, not despite her limb difference, but because of it. It was so empowering to see her on the big screen. Even Mad Max himself has worn a leg brace since the beginning. That's me wearing braces, trying to invoke my inner rogue. See, we have plenty of choice when it comes to escapism in games, so there's a lot of room to improve. Mostly when we see disability in games, it's really negative. So let's rip off this bandage. This is what I call my trilogy of tropes. We all know the squeaking of a wheel, an empty wheelchair rolling into a creepy hallway. Disability is often used to frighten people. The stigma is so pervasive that it took me 2 years of being housebound to work through it mentally before I could bring myself to use a wheelchair. Disability can sometimes be scary to the person going through it, but it shouldn't be horrifying to other people. It's similar to the difference between laughing at someone and with someone. The empty wheelchair is probably one of the most used pieces of creepy environmental storytelling after human skulls. It's definitely the most common way to encounter a wheelchair in games. In Fallout 4, I saw the same bulky, unfuturistic wheelchair about 563 times throughout the world. It was absurd. There are many examples, but Bloodborne is a standout. It has empty wheelchairs and wheelchair-using enemies. On the one hand, it's cool to think that these enemies are fully capable. Once I saw one of them miraculously descend a flight of stairs without tipping over, all while shooting me. I was aghast at the audacity. That quote up behind me, "I feel so emotionally ravaged by this game, and not in a good way," was not about the notorious difficulty. While I loved the game, the awful way wheelchairs were used crushed me. To top it all, the story ends with the player's character being trapped into the wheelchair as a cycle of fate doomed to be repeated forever. Apparently, being disabled is the ultimate horror in a world that's nothing but nightmares that killed you 194 times. And yes, I did count. It's left a wound that's prodded every time someone tells me how much they loved the story. Despite the common narrative that we're trapped in our wheelchairs, bound to them against our will, for many of us, they give us freedom. I adore my wheelchair. I've never felt as free and bloody cool as I do, zooming around 5 times faster than I'd been able to move in 2 decades, and with a fraction of the pain. It's a beautiful piece of engineering, too, not at all creepy. Our bodies, minds, or the devices we use shouldn't be used as a threat to make players feel scared. I'm tired of the same old depictions of disability that reinforce the negative ways others see me. And it's not all down to one game. It's like drops in an ocean. When disability is often seen as worse than death, then maybe it's natural to assume we want to die. Disabled people face death for many reasons, from terminal disease to serious accidents, or like me, I live with the risk that my body can break down without warning. I've actually survived death several times. Humans are survivors, because life is so worthwhile, even with disability or pain. Why is it so easy to imagine non-disabled characters doing anything necessary to survive an apocalypse, but when it comes to disabled characters in mundane settings, they probably want to die? In Life is Strange, Chloe becomes profoundly disabled due to a car accident. The player, as Max, is presented with the dilemma of helping her by killing her, or forcing her to keep living a life with no friends and nothing to do but stare at blank walls while in a lot of pain. Perhaps a more important story to explore would have been about quality of life, and why is the world failing Chloe so much that she's been left with this as her only wish? And why is it seen as a simple moral gray area whether her best friend murders her? The difficulty is there's a dash of truth to stories like these. But for me, the ethics in the way that they're presented are all wrong. I have friends who have been in accidents like Chloe. Until they learned to adapt and achieve the quality of life they deserved, they did struggle. But it's a mental health and social issue, not the fundamental state of being profoundly disabled. It's heartbreaking. We're passing up interesting narratives in favor of overtly negative cliches that center stigma and fear. If only these stories would examine the systems that fail us and end with disabled characters getting support and finding new purpose. The last in the trilogy, we're almost there. Detroit Become Human's disabled character, Carl, has a super cool wheelchair, which is something I've always wanted to see in a game, but at the same time, it was totally inappropriate for him given his apparent incapacity, boatload of money, and reliance on being carted around by an android. No one I know enjoys or prefers to be pushed around by other people, so it made little sense. There were many glaring errors, so I took bets on which bad cliché he was, the bitter, angry rich guy, or kind and pitiable. It was the latter. His character is largely a burden and two-dimensional, rooted in pity. By focusing on how incapable he is, it broadcasts how compassionate his android carer must be, and therefore, it rouses empathy for the android. Spoiler, of course he dies, which is a catalyst for the android's full sentience. These stories really aren't about our representation. They're both plot devices and for motivating non-disabled players into having bad feelings by exploiting disability stigma. It's all very much punching down and self-reinforcing. Ultimately, when this is how you're used to seeing characters like you, it's sad and exhausting. This is where Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice was different. It felt so much less exploitative. I spent a long time analyzing why a game that was focused on psychosis felt so mature and respectful. Ninja Theory didn't just work with doctors who diagnose and treat psychosis, they worked with people who have actual lived experience of it, actively working to correct their assumptions. In other avenues of diversity, we understand the importance of having marginalized people tell their own stories, if not directly, then via consultation and sensitivity reading. But unless they're experienced with disability, they aren't usually the right people to consult on that subject. Preferably, we should speak with disabled consultants. Hellblade was a piece of art, as evidenced by all the awards it's won. But it was more than that. I don't live with psychosis, but it spoke to me greatly. I've lived with anxiety, I've had episodes of dissociation, and I'm often an outsider, as Senua is. For me, they managed to transcend the tropes I associate with the thriller genre. Senua was powerful, tender, loving. The world was hard and terrible to her. She wasn't the cruel one, she wasn't pitiable, she's a survivor. She wanted to honor her love for the one person who had shown her kindness and affection. It was empowering. The game never looked down on her, but managed to still tell the story of her internal struggle. Senua also had a sight that meant she could solve puzzles and see hidden meanings. As an autistic person, this resonated, as I'm very good at quickly seeing patterns others might not. Often, though, this kind of magical ability frustrates disabled people. Many of my deaf and blind friends told me this was their least favorite trope, the savant. This is written in a variety of ways. Echolocation for blind characters is ironically usually shown visually, like in the game Perception. The cliché reinforces misconceptions people have about deaf and blind people, as well as projecting the fact that these characters are broken and can only be capable with a magical ability. I think Hellblade dodged this because it wasn't replacing anything, and it wasn't fundamental to her existence. It was just like any other skill in an adventure game like God of War. Again, it was empowering to her. I highly recommend watching the GDC talk given earlier this year. Spoiler, the team came to a great revelation that psychosis is just one of many ways to experience reality, i.e., we're all humans and disability is just normal human variation. More than anything, I would love to see more representation of casual disability. You really don't have to write about it. I see people beside themselves on social media whenever a character happens to be disabled in games like Overwatch because it's that rare at all. That's Angel Jeffria, cosplaying as McCree. She's a one-handed actress who has a real bionic arm. #representation matters. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was the first Tomb Raider I played since the original in 1996. Yes, I just look young. I was shocked and excited when not one but 3 NPCs I met were blind and disfigured. For all but one, there was no discussion of their disabilities. It was just who they were. And they were good people, and they didn't die. Back to the studio visit with the Gears of War team, there was discussion of representation and how that might look in a game with very physically fit characters. Now, I don't know for sure that it was my input, so I really can't take credit, but in the reveal trailer for Gears 5, we see one of the main characters, JD Phoenix, stop for a moment, wince in pain, and activate a futuristic prosthetic. See, one of the things I suggested is that there are more subtle ways to show a character might have a disability. From the trailer, it seems exactly like what I'd love to see. It doesn't even have to be main characters, side characters, bit characters, hell, even people in crowded street scenes. So start small. braces on characters' wrists, elbows, knees, or shoulders, an indication they have chronic pain. Young characters with mobility aids like canes, crutches, or wheelchairs. They don't even need to talk about it. Make deaf or blind characters that aren't old people or savants. How about giving a non-verbal character communication devices like smart device? Stop giving the disfigurements, limps, or limb differences to evil characters. And a note, disabled people are as diverse as all of humanity. We're not just white men. We need to see more disabled people of color, women, LGBTQ plus characters. Someone could be all of these. I have multiple disabilities, I'm bisexual, non-binary, and an adventurer. At this point, you might be thinking, screw it, I'm just gonna make a game about cats, because cats are easy. Well, hold it right there. This is my one-eyed boy, Odin, and he's here to tell you that you don't get off that easy. Ah, the missing eye. So what's this about villains? Evil characters are almost always crazy, disfigured, or disabled. Even when it's player choice to be evil, as in Mass Effect or Fable, you become disfigured and scarred. Deus Ex was ripe for exploring disability and what transhumanism might mean for disabled people. But like most cyberpunk narrative, there were no disabled people or accessible streets to be seen. I live with implants that make me an actual cyborg. There's a lot of people creating these futuristic worlds without exploring these kind of devices that we live with here and now. I use wheels, I get nutrition by IV, and I have a port that goes directly to my stomach. They're not a choice. They keep me alive and autonomous. They have potentially life-threatening malfunctions. I love the character design in Deus Ex. I mean, look at that. That's absolutely what I want my disability representation to look like. It's one of my favorite IPs. But Hugh Darren is the villain in Deus Ex Human Revolution. He's genetically incompatible with the technology he invented, augmentations. Unable to cure his own disabilities, he became hell-bent on destroying augmented people. It came so close. Genetic incompatibility is quite realistic. I frequently think about the fact that if I were to ever need prosthetics, they wouldn't actually be an option to me because my skin is too fragile. But why does that leave to Darrow becoming instrumental in augmented people's persecution? This is bigotry. Disability doesn't make us bigots. Of course, he also dies. Disabled people aren't all good and wholesome, and I don't want to make this claim, but too often in games, disability is just a signpost for evilness. This is why we need to see the characteristics applied more positively and frequently. Shocking idea. Maybe even have more than one disabled character. 1/4 of the world is disabled, and when you only have a single representation in a game, they'll by design be a stereotype. So having more than one can mitigate that. Overcooked is a fun game. One of the playable characters, a raccoon, is in a wheelchair. I love it so much. We don't know why he uses a wheelchair, and we don't need to. Of course, this requires making the levels accessible, but that should be happening more anyway. There's nothing weirder than playing a game and noting the city that I'm walking around in doesn't have a single disabled person, a dropped curb, or that there's stairs everywhere. Where did we all go? Night in the Woods was a cult favorite. This is partly because the whimsical story and characters had a lot to identify with. It had excellent LGBTQ+ representation and surprisingly good mentions of sleep issues, anxiety, depression, and unusual movements like flapping. There was no physical disability, but many of us affectionately appreciate the nods to mental health and neurodiversity. So Hammerlock in Borderlands 2 was probably one of my favorite disabled NPCs. He had robotic, well, half his body was robotic. He was so funny and as wholesome as it gets in the Borderlands universe. Also, half his quests were ridiculous escapades of revenge on the creatures that took his body parts. Mass Effect is a difficult one to celebrate because it had one of the most horrific depictions of an autistic character I may have ever seen. He was tortured. But it also had one of the best physically disabled characters. Joker was the Normandy's star pilot. It's a shame he wasn't a party character, but he was extremely capable, highly intelligent, and damn hilarious. His disability was brittle bone disease, which incidentally is a sister disease to mine, and so I saw a lot of myself in Joker. Wait, that sounds like I'm calling myself super smart and funny? He made fun of his own disabilities and the crew's awkwardness about it in a very endearing and realistic way. The crew highly respected Joker, and Shepard even risked her life to save him. Yes, sorry, shepherd will always be a woman to me. Sorry, Chris. I know you used male shep. Doesn't exist. Finally, Moss was the first character that used sign language in a game. Since I'm not deaf, here's what one odd gamer girl had to say on Twitter. Seeing Moss use ASL brought me to tears. Seeing the language I've used my entire life finally put in a game as a mechanic and not just a plot device for some victim. It was just incredible. I don't mean to say never explore disability as a main story arc. It's just that we're still at a point that even when it's not overwhelmingly negative, stories about disabled people aren't exactly positive and have a lot of assumptions. The wheelchair and the surge is a surprise as you take hold of the controls. I was so excited, I squealed and spent an hour wheeling around where there was zero game content because I knew the inevitable was likely coming. The wheelchair wouldn't last. The inevitable cure takes the form of an exosuit, which is a common plot device along with magical medicine. Much like Deus Ex, the assumption seems to be that all disability should be cured and that technology will be the answer. The end of the game is again contempt and fear for the wheelchair, with it being used with horror to taunt the player. The installation of the exosuit is also highly disturbing. But I have really conflicting feelings about the surge because I love the game. It's similar to Bloodborne in more than one way. But in the end, I'll always fondly remember wheeling around an empty, boring train station, enjoying somewhat accurate wheelchair physics for the first time ever. We just need to move towards telling disabled stories in more positive and respectful ways with less sad stereotypes. By the way, I know I'm probably over time by this point, but Starlink, A Battle for Atlas, came out just a week ago, and it almost perfectly embodies everything I've been asking for today, so I had to mention it. So if you do want to know how to do it properly, check out the game because it blew me away. I was very emotional. So here's a quick summary. Please do include disability in your characters, crowds, and worlds. Include disability and diversity efforts. Portray disability positively. Make disabled characters diverse. Include invisible disability and mental health. Consult disabled people. But please don't make assumptions. Exploit disability as a tool for negative emotions. Erase disability entirely. And please just stop making all the villains disabled. TV Tropes is also an excellent resource to acquaint yourself with common mistakes on representation across the board, not just disability. And a footnote. Language is hard, especially because there are cultural differences between countries and even among individuals. For example, do we say disabled person or person with disability? I prefer disabled person, as do most of my friends, so the short of it is, it's not rude to ask, so don't be afraid to. In fact, it will likely be much more appreciated than using euphemisms like differently abled. Final footnote, I promise. Since this day is all about accessibility, I have to ask, if you're going to feature stories about disabled characters, please make your games as accessible as possible to those people. So it's dangerous to go alone. Take us. I often start wrapping up on this note because it's that important. If you involve disabled people in your process as early as possible, you'll be less likely to fall into common traps like exploitation and assumption. Whether actively hiring more disabled people on your team or bringing consultants or sensitivity readers, ultimately, we're the experts on what it's like to live with disabilities. Grab my details or chat with any of us here over drinks, which I'm sure you're all dying for. I am running really late. If you're looking for more perspectives outside of mine, that list is a bunch of Twitter handles of really great disability and gaming advocates that you would probably enjoy following. I truly believe that positive disability representation can begin to heal trauma and stigma. But it doesn't need to be an explicit message. At the moment, we often just don't exist on a fundamental level in most games. A less direct approach often reaches greater audiences than when we take a giant hammer and write change on it. Games are just so powerful because they penetrate people's lives, no matter the genre or how serious they are. I adore this industry to my very core. I admire and appreciate everyone that works so hard to bring us the games we love. And I fully recognize that sometimes, in order to get better, we need to make mistakes. I hope I haven't been too unkind, and that this has been helpful to make your wonderful games even more inclusive of everyone. Thanks so much to GAConf for having me, and for being here today at this amazing conference. Remember, anyone can be disabled. 1/4 of the world identifies as such, and games are profoundly important in so many disabled people's lives. And finally, please don't forget, I took an arrow in the knee and I'm still an adventurer.